The first dog-exclusionary handheld of all time, the Game Boy Color is a fascinating example of taking almost a decade to do something that sounds so simple these days, and that's colour. But the handheld also boasted a few technical upgrades too, more than enough to help you run into the same Pidgey for the 17th time in a row in more detail than ever. Grab your nearest lamp and 2 AA batteries, we're looking at the 50 best Game Boy Color games of all time. Sadly, John Romero didn't make you his good time boy when the main version of Daikatana dropped, with one of the most overhyped FPS games ever flopping harder than your mum off the top diving board. What people might not know about Daikatana though, well, if they haven't been on this channel, because we've mentioned it a few times, is that the Game Boy Color version is actually pretty decent, largely because it's a completely different game. And it works, and it's for people to play. Incredible. While the main version of Daikatana is a first-person shooter, the GBC version is a top-down adventure game akin to Zelda, and the game makes proper use of dungeons and puzzles to create a pretty engaging handheld adventure. It might not be on the same level as an actual Zelda game, of course, but if you're done with those and looking for something similar, check out Daikatana, but only on the Game Boy Color. Street Fighter has more of a handheld reputation than you'd think, especially when it comes to the Game Boy. Granted, the original Game Boy port of Street Fighter 2 might be one of the worst versions of the iconic Capcom brawler you could ever play, but they did try. Thankfully, Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams manages to condense the gameplay of its bigger version pretty well onto Nintendo's handheld. Sure, the graphics aren't as good, there's one less strength option for attacks as it's dependent on how hard you press the buttons, and crucially there's no multiplayer, but the 1v1 fighting gameplay is basically all present and accounted for. If nothing else, it is a curious precursor to the Alpha 3 port on the GBA, which is absolutely phenomenal. Look, what you should know now is that a lot of Game Boy Color games were ports of bigger games. They're often not as good, or compromised in some way, but the fact that they tried is hella ambitious. Something that fits the ambitious bill is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, which should look familiar to anyone who loves the Ollie Ollie skateboarding games. Side-scrolling skateboarding is still sick skateboarding, and we don't make the rules. Turpus Tur on the Gubba Sir is more than just side-scrolling though, as the game blends side camera jumps and half-pipes with top-down exploration and grinding depending on the park, creating arguably the most unique version of Turpus Tur out there. With 7 levels and 13 playable skaters, yeah, this is a pretty faithful take on a classic. How do you convert one of the most beloved first-person shooters on the N64 to the Game Boy Color? Well, the answer is don't make it a first-person shooter. That's the solution that Rare went with for Perfect Dark, turning the adventures of Joanna Dark into a top-down shooter. It also happens to be a prequel to the original game, telling a brand new story of Dark completing her training to become a secret agent. Players need to use a range of stealth and superior weapons and gadgets to complete several missions across the globe, setting the stage for the battle between the Carrington Institute and Datadyne. The gameplay is solid, but what's even more impressive is the fact that Perfect Dark on the GBC supported multiplayer for 2 players. You know what, Worms might be one of the most recognisable games ever made. You have a team of cute little guys who say things like incoming in a really high-pitched voice, and you use strong weapons and sometimes a concrete donkey in order to beat the other team. Worms Armageddon for the GBC even manages to avoid the multiplayer pitfalls other multiplayer games fall into, considering Worms is turn-based. Admittedly, Worms Armageddon is a pretty scaled-down version of the PC release, with worse graphics and music, along with less weapons to utilise. Still, the core gameplay, terrain destruction, and physics are all here, present and accounted for. Playing Worms on the go is much easier these days, but back then, this was pretty much essential. Considering that Klax had been around since 1990, it's not surprising that Atari managed to make the game fit a handheld. Unfortunately for those who were hoping for the game on the original Game Boy, Klax wouldn't work considering it's a colour matching game, after all, you know. Soon as Nintendo found a way to add colour to its handheld though, Atari were in there as soon as possible with a GBC release for Klax. You control a little catcher thingy-majig on the end of a conveyor belt majig, and must use it to catch and place tiles. Match 3 of the same colour, you clear them from the board. It's simple, it's fun, and it's a great handheld puzzle game, even if Tetris is just a bit better. Arguably among the most hidden gems of puzzle games anyway, Wectrix for the N64 and Dreamcast is a bonkers mix of dam building, water management, and block-based puzzle gaming. Sure, there might be better and more refined versions of Wectrix, but that doesn't mean that Wectrix GB should be dismissed from your mind. In fact, this is a pretty decent attempt at showcasing the gameplay formula. You're given a square grid, and periodically clusters of blocks will drop that'll form walls you'll need to use eventually to keep water from falling off the sides. Once bombs and other hazards start being thrown in, Wectrix becomes a tough management/puzzle hybrid that's hard to put down. It's impressive that they managed to fit this on a cart, honestly. Actually, really impressive Game Boy Color games. You want that video? Let us know down below. Gran Turismo might have been the top dog. Lots of dog-based stuff going on in this list, isn't there? When it comes to simulation racing games on the PlayStation, but for a long time, the Toka Touring Car Championship offered a more than worthy alternative. Woof. If PlayStation had a portable in the 1990s, Codemasters would have ported Toka there too, and they did when Sony did develop a handheld, but in the year 2000, they settled for the Game Boy Color. The GBC version of Toka harkens back to the older days of racing, with an isometric 3D perspective instead of the camera plonked either behind the car or in the cockpit. Aside from that though, Toka for the GBC is a feature-complete port and a brilliant handheld racer. The way people talk about the Conker series, you'd think the squirrel emerged from the primordial ooze, dual-wielding Uzis and swearing at everyone in sight, but the reality is a bit more mundane than that. Of course, we all know about Conker in Diddy Kong Racing, but Rare actually released the first Conker game 2 years before the N64's Bad Fur Day, with Conker's Pocket Tales and the Game Boy Color, and hey, you know what? It is pretty good. A more cutesy affair than you'd expect from anything with the name Conker, the game sees the titular squirrel trying to rescue his kidnapped girlfriend and retrieve his stolen birthday presents. The whole game presents itself as a top-down Zelda-like adventure with plenty of puzzles to solve along the way. Much like how Toka took a PS1 game and ported it to the Game Boy Color, Azure Dreams did much the same, but that's where the similarities between those two end. Instead of racing cars, Azure Dreams is all about dungeon diving and monster rearing, and while the GBC version doesn't have the town building and romance options of the PS1 release, it is a cool Pokemon alternative for Game Boy lovers. Set in the town of Mons Bayer, players control a young adventurer by the name of Ko who enters the Monster Tower to look for his missing dad. A roguelike, which was pretty rare for the time, Ko resets on every entry to the dungeon, but the monsters he raises don't, so progression comes with upgrading the monsters throughout. Pretty neat stuff. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color are home to plenty of ports to arcade or older home console games that managed to scale down to handheld hardware, and R-Type DX, a re-release of the game from 1987, absolutely fits that bill. As a remake/remaster, R-Type DX is basically a bare-bones re-release of a classic shoot-'em-up, but a classic is a classic for a reason. R-Type whips. Like most horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-ups, you're just one ship alone against the overwhelming alien hordes, and I mean, why meddle with a classic, right? With 8 levels, each with a boss waiting at the end, and plenty of power-ups to find along the way, you'll have your work cut out for you finishing this one. There are a few games that are about kids collecting toys and then using them to fight other kids with toys, but most of them, like Custom Robo or Gotcha Force, are confined to 3D arenas. Power Quest does things a bit differently, offering a fighting game alongside a toy collecting experience. Even if there's only 6 toy models to fight as, this is a pretty cool and ambitious handheld fighting game. Players control a young kid during summer vacation as he uses his cool new toy to destroy everyone else's cool new toy. Winning allows you to earn new parts and upgrade your abilities as you explore the overworld trying to find new people to fight. The action isn't the most complex, but it's genuinely pretty enjoyable stuff. In another universe or dimension, there'd have been hundreds of Monster Rancher games and dozens of anime shows and films, and Pokemon would merely be a footnote, but it's not to be. We're not complaining about the rise of Pokemon, but it would have been cool to see more Monster Rancher games, especially with their cool usage of physical media to generate monsters in-game. Monster Rancher Battle Card GB obviously can't rely on CDs for monster creation though, so instead players take a personality test to receive a deck of playing cards. You build your deck as you go through dungeons, fighting as other deck holders and random guardians, so if you love deck builders, check this one out. Considering other Monster Rancher games are on Switch, let's get a port soon, yeah? Trying to play a point-and-click adventure game on a handheld like the Game Boy Color, with a tiny screen and restrictive lack of buttons, might seem like a fool's errand. Somehow though, the remake of ICOM's classic NES release feels right at home on the Game Boy Color, with a new coat of paint, improved art and sprites, and an enhanced interface that helps the game adapt to handheld. The story is still the same as it was on the NES, with players journeying to the mysterious castle Shadowgate in order to defeat the Warlock Lord. Players need to explore room by room, dodging traps and solving puzzles in order to find the tools you need to conquer the Warlock Lord once and also for all. Pokemon really did unleash a wave of successors and imitators, especially on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, as other developers tried to emulate the monster catching and fighting gameplay of Pikachu and the gang. While Pokemon was all about pocket monsters, Magi Nation, based on the collectible card game Magi Nation Duel, focuses on the capture and taming of dream creatures who can be used in battle. The game follows young lad Tony Jones, who's transported to another magical world with the ability to summon dream creatures. Using these creatures, Tony attempts to save the world from the scourge of shadow geysers that are plaguing the land. With 4 creatures fighting at one time, Magi Nation is great for anyone wanting an army of cute critters. When you think of Ubisoft and platformers, chances are that you're probably thinking of Rayman, but if you're a fan of everyone's favourite Double D, Ubisoft also created a pretty excellent Donald Duck platformer called Going Quackers. This low-key whipper launched on mostly 3D platforms, but Ubisoft also ported Donald Duck Going Quackers to the Game Boy Color as a 2D platformer, and Ubisoft had a good plan for it. Essentially, Donald Duck Going Quackers used the engine from Rayman 2 in order to bring the game to Game Boy Color, and removed the 3D sections of the game by converting them all to 2D levels. The result is an excellent platformer that's more than a mere handheld counterpart to the bigger console releases. Come see what the Quack is all about. Imagine playing an amazing RPG experience on the PS1 and finding out that there's a follow-up / spin-off. You'd be excited to play it, right? Well, if you were a Star Ocean the Second Story fan, you'd end up disappointed if you didn't own a Game Boy Color, as Star Ocean Blue Sphere continued the plot to that RPG classic, and you'd be especially disappointed to learn that it's actually pretty bloody good. Blue Sphere is set 2 years after the event of the second story, with the protagonist from that original game forced onto a new planet called Edifice, a pre-space flight civilization. You need to figure out why you're here and how to leave, using the series' trademark real-time combat to do so. A real overlooked gem, this one. Apologies to headphone users in advance, but the name of this game is stylized with an exclamation point. Anyway, Denki Blocks is a puzzle game that launched on both the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color. In fact, the Game Boy Color version of Denki Blocks only launched on the GBC in Europe, but nothing was lost in translation, bringing the GBC version to life. A fiendish little puzzler, Denki Blocks sees players sliding sticky blocks around a level to match blocks of the same colour together, but the gimmick is that all blocks not fixed in place or obstructed will slide, and that coloured blocks will come together when they touch. It sounds like they're simple rules, but Denki Blocks will have you tearing your hair out. We don't really need to explain Tetris at this point, do we? Arguably the most famous and most played game of all time, the original Tetris was one of the biggest reasons why the first Game Boy became the juggernaut cultural success that it was. Yeah, Tetris had its share of sequels also on the original Game Boy, but Tetris DX was the first Game Boy entry in the Tetris series with colour, along with other enhancements and improvements. All the usual Tetris gameplay is here and accounted for, but the twist is that there's a couple of new modes like Ultra Mode and 40 Lines, along with support for multiplayer via the Game Boy Color's link cable. At that point, it was the definitive Tetris experience. You might see the name Wendy every which way and think it's some kind of arcane tie-in to the Clint Eastwood film with the pet orangutan, and you'd be half right actually. No, Eastwood isn't decking dudes in this one, but you're right in that it's a tie-in, specifically a tie-in to the Casper series and the character of Wendy the Good Little Witch. WayForward took this underutilized character and turned them into the star of a cute and enjoyable platformer. After accidentally causing a floating castle to crash into her auntie's house, players control the titular witch as they progress through over a dozen levels, blending 2D platforming and horizontal shoot-'em-ups. It's an underrated entry in the GBC's library, and one that deserves more love. Considering the Blaster Master series started life on the NES, it's not a surprise that the series made its way to the Game Boy Color as well. A continuation of the events of the previous games, Blaster Master Enemy Below once again follows the adventures of Jason and his special tank Sophia as they trawl through underground dungeons in an endless war against mutants. What separated Blaster Master from other shoot-'em-ups is that players switch from behind the wheel of Sophia to more platforming-focused exploration levels with Jason, giving the game a bit of a Titanfall predecessor feel. Kind of, maybe. Arguably. Using sprites from that original NES game, Blaster Master Enemy Below is an accurate handheld translation of an underappreciated retro series. After all the gaming mascots in the world had their fill of kart racing, such as Diddy Kong Racing, Crash Team Racing, and of course Mario Kart, it was only a matter of time before the biggest mascot in the world got in on the action. At least Disney had the smarts to let Rare, the developers of Diddy Kong Racing, man the helm though, as Mickey's Racing Adventure is a Game Boy Color standout. An adventure-focused kart racer, players control Mickey along with others as you unlock them as you try to recover what was stolen from you by the villainous Pete. The game is split into two halves with the standard racing interspersed with overworld exploration and minigames. It's ambitious and looks gorgeous to boot. It might not have reached the same heady heights of the Game Boy, but the Game & Watch handheld system is a core part of Nintendo's handheld history, and to their credit, Nintendo for a while seemed willing to celebrate that part of their journey every chance they got. We're still waiting for the Game & Watch Gallery games to appear on those Switch emulators, but for now, let's talk about Game & Watch Gallery 3. Bafflingly, the fourth Game & Watch compilation, the first being Game Boy Gallery in 1995, Game & Watch Gallery 3 was the first developed purely for the Game Boy Color. The previous game was developed for the original Game Boy first, while 3 offered more games along with the modern graphical enhancements. It's just a more complete compilation, and it's still decent fun today. Hamtaro might just be one of the most famous hamsters in all of fiction, with the star of Japanese storybooks and anime even getting a few video games on Nintendo platforms. Most tend to remember the GBA release of Hamtaro Ham Ham Heartbreak, but the predecessor, Ham Hams Unite, is just as good of a handheld adventure for kids as the sequel is, even if it is guilty of hamming it up. Bacon. An adventure game that uses vocabulary to solve puzzles, players are trying to gather all the hamsters together for a clubhouse meeting while filling out their HamChat dictionary. These new words will allow you to interact with more characters and progress through the game. It's like the Rosetta Stone but with hamsters. And it was also the final GBC game by Nintendo, and they went out with a bang. Mario's sports career might be more impressive than most athletes, considering the fact he seems to dominate at whatever sports he tries. Football, golf, racing, baseball, Mario has done it all and seemingly done it on every single Nintendo platform, but if you're looking for his best efforts on the Game Boy Color, it has to be Mario Tennis. Game, set, and match. That's tennis, right? One of the games that introduced RPG-like modes to the Mario sports games, Mario Tennis for the GBC was a companion to the N64 release, albeit better because, again, it had that significant single-player mode as part of the package. The rest of the game is your standard tennis action, but because it's a Mario sports game, you know its peak. Back of the net. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone if you like chippy chips, might be the most surprising entry of them all. Games based on movie licenses are famously uneven at best. Harry Potter in particular has been the foundation for a library of numerous games across several consoles, and most of them are a bit crap. The Game Boy Color edition of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone in particular has received praise for being one of the exceptions, and it doesn't take long playing the game to appreciate why. Presented as a traditional RPG, the game has players controlling Harry as he begins his time at Hogwarts. You'll go through basically the plot of the story, gaining experience to build up your levels. It's extremely well executed and surprisingly deep for the Game Boy Color. Even if you don't have the slightest interest in backwards faces and whatnot, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone on the Game Boy Color is worth playing. Beyond cute graphics and engaging gameplay, Tokitori tells the simple story of a baby chicken trying to find his missing family, doing so with a style that blends serious puzzle solving with action game elements. You'll travel across 4 worlds and some 60 levels, utilising a variety of highly limited skills like building, teleportation, and even freezing stuff. It's up to you to put these skills to work in the most intelligent way possible, often dodging an assortment of enemies because you will almost never be able to stop them directly. Tokitori is one of the most challenging GBC games of all time, and it's another hidden gem of sorts, and is a must-play for anyone digging back into Nintendo's iconic handheld. Certainly the sort of action platform puzzle game that will take you a long time to master. The human armies of Queen Azarel are warring with the beast armies of Chief Zog in Warlocked. In this real-time strategy game from Bytes Studios, you can choose to play as either of these 2 armies across 30 missions. The usual demands of a real-time strategy title can be found here, such as careful resource management and strategic use of your forces. RTS games for handhelds were pretty rare for the time, but you look at a game like Warlocked and you wonder why. If you're willing to be a little patient and get used to everything Warlocked is throwing at you, there's a 20+ hour playing experience to enjoy here. Overall, Warlocked is an extremely absorbing experience, and not even some quibbles like the loopy AI of your soldiers can ruin the day. Mega Man Xtreme 2 received praise at the time of its 2001 release for being a substantial improvement over the previous entry. A portable Mega Man X experience sounded great on paper, and it was the sequel's ability to juggle elements from 4 different X games that made for a Game Boy Color whipper. Control X or Zero across several stages in which you must defeat the Maverick robot enemies while solving the mystery of why Reploids are breaking down and losing their souls. Obviously not as deep as the SNES/PS1 Mega Man X games, Mega Man Xtreme 2 nevertheless sees Capcom maintaining the graphics, sounds, controls, and difficulty that made this series a worthy successor to the original Mega Man titles in the first place. Completionists aren't the only ones who should keep Mega Man Xtreme 2 in their Game Boy Color libraries. Bomberman Quest for the Game Boy Color is among the many examples of why Bomberman pretty much always does well. The best Bomberman games keep the banger formula of doing big bangs in banging ways, and Bomberman Quest is no exception in this regard. Our titular hero doesn't forget what people are expecting from him, but there's also the fact that the best Bomberman games also find ways to spice up the norm. Instead of chaotic combat in a series of arena stages, Bomberman Quest works as an action RPG that uses the gameplay of placing bombs and running like hell to ingenious perfection. It never fails to be enjoyable, but the game also includes a battle mode that lets you enjoy the fundamentals without any extra frills. Either version is the character at his best. With a lineage going back to the iconic Dig Dug series, Mr. Driller presents a simple premise with an ingenious execution and visual niceties. Combining quick thinking with meticulous planning, this puzzle game saw a wide range of console releases in 1999 and 2000. The Game Boy Color edition impressively stood out alongside entries for the PlayStation and Sega Dreamcast. Without ever getting too frustrating or too easy, Mr. Driller is one of the most enjoyable, engaging puzzle games released for the Game Boy Color, and Mr. Driller itself is always a good time. Pick it up today and you will easily find yourself losing a few hours of your life drilling down instead of just spiraling out like usual. Crystalis was a solid indication that the Game Boy Color had the ability to look and play nearly as well as the NES. That's an impressive achievement for this little system, although obviously this port of the Nintendo classic Crystalis has some limitations. You're not likely to notice these limitations, however, as you'll probably be too busy enjoying one of the best RPGs of the 8-bit era. The top-down style of Crystalis looks pretty great here. The game isn't perfect in its action RPG execution, but it still presents a comprehensive and ultimately pretty engrossing experience, especially on the go. Crystalis is a famously easy title in this genre to just simply pick up and play. Besides, when else are you going to play an RPG that's developed by SNK, of all people? Also known as Stranded Kids in the UK, survival kids might call to mind overhead action RPGs like The Legend of Zelda. As a young boy stranded on a mysterious island, it becomes your job to not only survive your surroundings, but also manage the day-to-day challenges of simply keeping yourself alive and functional. It becomes imperative to drink water, eat food, and get some rest. And this was all a pretty long time before the survival boom that took over Steam. The use of a clever merge system also helps survival kids to stand out as something unique and well worth playing on your Game Boy Boy Color. This IP hadn't seen too much attention for many years, then they released a new one and nobody wanted to play with kids on an island for obvious reasons. Before he was betrayed by those wretched rabbits, Rayman as a character had a perfectly respectable run of platformers for the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and even the Jaguar. The Game Boy Color edition of Rayman sticks as closely as possible to the formula established with the first game's release in 1995. You'll hunt for power-ups, manage tricky platforming situations, and do everything in your power to stop the sinister Mr. Dark for good. Rayman, specifically on the Game Boy Color but not limited to the Game Boy Color, can be immensely frustrating at times, but with impressive replay value and a general sense of fun that draws you in. Rayman's Game Boy Color outing is not a perfect port, of course, but still a great time on a handheld. Originally released for the original Game Boy in 1997, the endlessly charming Legend of the River King received a stellar Game Boy Color update just a couple of years later. The last thing you want to do is assume this fishing game, developed by the same company responsible for the Harvest Moon franchise, is that it's simply a fishing game. While that's obviously a big part of the proceedings, Legend of the River King aspires to offer a deeper experience. For the most part, Legend of the River King succeeds admirably in this regard. Dealing with monsters, supply challenges, and other factors all create a marvellous game that regrettably comes to an end a bit too soon. Still, an elite Game Boy Color game. Bionic Commando Elite Forces doesn't forget the core concepts of why Bionic Commando was such a hit. Elite Forces presents you with a hefty challenge by forcing you to use your bionic arm for all your platforming needs, but also throws in two characters with slightly differing play experiences, some great sniper sequences, and the usual high degree of difficulty the Bionic Commando franchise is known for. The learning curve behind Bionic Commando Elite Forces can be a bit much for younger players, but old school NES fans already know what they're in for here. A truly excellent Bionic Commando release and one of the best and also most underrated Game Boy Color games. King Dedede is once again trying to make life difficult for everyone around him, and only Kirby can save the day. There's nothing groundbreaking in the plot of Kirby Tilt and Tumble, but the little pink platforming hero, whose career began on the original Game Boy 8 years prior, is in fantastic form on this Game Boy Color release all the same. You know, it's pretty easy to pick up and get the hang of Kirby Tilt and Tumble, which has players using tilting and moving their Game Boy Color to move Kirby in ball form along the various challenges and stages the game presents. Getting this game completely down is another matter though. If you want Monkey Ball sans Monkey on your Game Boy Color, Kirby Tilt and Tumble can be unforgiving in the best way possible. Perhaps sadly, R-Type DX refers to Deluxe and not D-Generation X. That would have been an interesting hybrid of things that were very popular in 1999, the year this game was released. This updated and distinctly improved remake of two original Game Boy games was a case of serious ambition. What we got was nothing short of fantastic, with a brilliant shooter getting lavish and entertaining treatment on the portable color handheld. Despite the relative simplicity of the gameplay, there is a shocking amount of depth to be enjoyed with R-Type DX. The game is easily accessible for those who don't play these sorts of games very often, but the challenge and higher difficulty settings will put even the most dedicated players through their paces. Harvest Moon was the definitive adorable farming/life simulator until Animal Crossing came along. The series hit some of its best notes in this particular period, with Harvest Moon 2 being arguably the best of the three releases the Game Boy Color received. The series hits a level of refinement here that makes plunking a few hours into Harvest Moon 2 seem like the easiest thing in the world. While admittedly a little dated in some elements, Harvest Moon 2 is still a stellar example of the Game Boy Color being able to offer a life simulation experience surprisingly faithful as often as possible to the Super Nintendo original. It's not without some frustration, sure, but Harvest Moon 2 is still cute and compulsory. A turn-based card game on the Game Boy Color doesn't sound immediately exciting, even if it has a title as immediately cool as Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors. While it might be difficult to imagine a DBZ game that's not a fighting or RPG title, Legendary Super Warriors will surprise you again and again with its fascinating hybrid genres. Not only is the game as visually pleasing as any card game could hope to get, it's also just an absolute blast to play. Even if you're not someone who considers themselves a fan of turn-based games, card games, or both, DBZ Legendary Super Warriors is worth your time. With a story mode, battle mode, and multiplayer mode, this one manages to use its unique mechanics in a way that still feels like DBZ, and one of the most underrated video game adaptations of the legendary franchise too. As impressive as the Game Boy Color was by the year 2000, when Donkey Kong Country for the handheld was released, no one expected the system to flawlessly replicate the 1994 SNES hit. Having said that, there is a lot to be impressed with here. The game is visually pretty strong given the honest limitations of the Game Boy Color, and at least gets close to looking much like it did on the Super Nintendo 6 years prior. Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color is also just a lot of fun to play. The controls are simplified but responsive, and the game's wildly swinging pendulum of stroke-inducing difficulty remains more intact than you might think. There's even some genuinely enjoyable bonus content too. Natsume unquestionably had a fantastic run on the Game Boy Color, bringing 8-bit quality JRPGs and other titles like Lufia: The Legend Returns to the handheld. With a unique battle system and an unexpectedly complex narrative, this would be the third release in the series. It's largely forgotten today by everyone except the most dedicated and sadly aging JRPG enthusiasts. That is a shame. You know why? Well, Lufia: The Legend Returns is everything you could want from a JRPG on the go. Lufia: The Legend Returns will throw some extremely challenging dungeons your way. The 3x3 battle formation pattern you work with, featuring 9 characters in play at any given time, only heightens how satisfying it is when it all comes together beautifully. Dragon Warrior 3 features, relatively stunning graphics and sound, a new dungeon, a new character class, and a bunch of new monsters. To a certain point, this JRPG classic, originally released for the NES a full decade earlier, feels and even plays like a completely different game. Even though it's technically a port of a Super Famicom release, Dragon Warrior 3 for the Game Boy Color actually manages to add a few more bells and whistles that really help to modernize it. Anyone who considers themselves to be a big fan of JRPGs should make it a point to play this version in some form or fashion. If you can get your hands on the Game Boy Color version, you'll be playing an absolute classic. The Game Boy Color was near the end of the line by 2002 when Shantae was released, as the Game Boy Advance had become the primary focus of Nintendo's handheld console attention. Yet the system was still putting out some great games 2 years into the new millennium. Shantae deserves love just for how beautiful this game still looks after 20 plus years. 25 years next year. Goodness me. The sprites for Shantae are still unique and engaging, to say the least, as they honestly don't look like they've aged today. The backgrounds and colour are vibrant and magnificent and help you dance the night away. A platformer with some unique touches, Shantae is still going strong to this day, and it's thanks to this brilliant game. Listen, we're not going to go so far as to call Wario Land 3 a Metroidvania. Still, the game does have elements of Metroid backed into its ludicrous character designs and wacky, sarcastic story. Wario can be the most entertaining character in the room, and the depth and varied cleverness of Wario Land 3 shows us how and why. Something particularly great about Wario Land 3 is its inclusion of special abilities, which will have you returning to previously finished levels to look for new paths and treasures. You're going to have a pretty comprehensive understanding of this game's map and its challenging level design before it's all said and done, and you're going to want to dive right back in all over again. Shame Nintendo won't know, eh? Mario Golf was a surprisingly popular game for the Nintendo 64 because, golf ain't that sexy. The Game Boy Color port is no different, but manages to utilise the limitations and possibilities of the GBC to create something that's quite special. Personality abounds in Mario Golf, from the RPG elements to the excellent graphics and sound, and even considering the fun story. Mario Golf succeeds as both a game you can pick up and play in just a few minutes, and as a deeper game that'll keep you busy for longer than you might think. To combine both of those gameplay approaches in a single game is pretty impressive stuff. Mario Golf even manages to be pretty faithful to the game of golf itself for purists, whereas late entries went a little wild with the concept. The fact that Metal Gear Solid doesn't make the top 3 doesn't mean that it's only some handheld spin-off. It's just that the Game Boy Color's library really was that strong. This was a period in which Nintendo was really showing off what they could do with a handheld system that had a little bit more power behind it. In no way is this alternate version of the PlayStation juggernaut, also known as Metal Gear Ghost Barbel, a copy of that game exactly, as it's more like a continuation of the original Metal Gear games. However, there's still a lot that can be done with gameplay, atmosphere and even character design, especially on such a small screen. On all those fronts, and for being bold enough to imagine a different continuity in the already wild Metal Gear timeline, Metal Gear Solid is a winner on the Game Boy Color. Super Mario Bros. Deluxe promised the legendary NES original with some essential and decidedly very good fun bonus features thrown in for good measure. What players got was a game that offered enough updates to the classic to make it worth the time of new and experienced fans alike. The Mario vs. Boo mode alone is a ton of fun, but there's also Super Mario Bros. For super players, a feature that is basically a remake of the Lost Levels. You're getting a pretty definitive piece of Mario history in one chunky package with Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. Besides offering so much playability, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe also features the ability to save your game, which is a lifesaver on super players. If you want the definitive version of the classic Mario experience on the go, this may just be it. You know, it's still crazy that there were more innovations between the first 2 gens of Pokemon than the later ones. Pokemon Gold, Silver or Crystal features some of the best Mon designs in the franchise, as well as some interesting improvements, such as breeding, which you probably don't want to think about too much, and real-time clocks, that only add to the experience of travelling the world and catching all. For some fans, this generation represents the very pinnacle of what these games have to offer. Whether or not your love of these games goes that far, you can't deny that Pokemon Gold, Silver and Crystal are easy to get into for even the newest of gamers. Even if you don't think of yourself as a fan or need the more modern trimmings of the remakes, you can't help but get absorbed as you travel across Johto even today. These sold 18 billion copies for a good reason, but the best Game Boy Color game ever has to be quirky was the word of the decade for Zelda fans. In addition to a very good remake of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Color also got 2 games that create a single, almost breathtaking experience once paired together. Amazingly, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons provided even more entertainment for fans at a time when Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask had cemented the Zelda series as one of the biggest game franchises in the world. Oracle of Ages and Seasons weren't just the same game with some minor differences, as they're both completely different campaigns with unique dungeons. They weren't even fully developed by Nintendo, which was quite the rarity at the time, as Flagship, often confused with Capcom, stepped up to put their spin on the formula. A unique pass-through system even enabled you to experience both games as a complete playing and narrative experience. It was a bold move that paid off in Nintendo and The Legend of Zelda at large, and it resulted in the best Game Boy Color game of all time. Actual gang, those were the 50 best Game Boy Color games of all time, and also that might be the last 50 best console list of all time thingy we do. Unless you guys really want a Dreamcast one or any other console in particular, let us know down below. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures. It's been good to have you, and I'll catch you when I get you.